Now we have to classify the cost on the basis of how the cost is behaving with respect to level of activity. It means that what is the behavior of the cost if we increase the level of activity, what nature will the cost show. So on this basis we will classify the cost. So by behavior, cost is of four types. Number one is variable cost. Now the variable cost, the word variable means it comes from the word varies, and varies means change. So variable cost is a cost that vary in direct production proportion with the level of activity. As the level of activity increases, the total variable cost will also increase. So such a cost that will increase with level of activity, with the production units, with the increase in production units, such cost will be known as variable cost. Okay. Now there are two important points that are mentioned here. The total cost increase with activity levels. The cost per unit for variable cost remains constant. So it's important to understand this thing, that the variable cost in total it will increase, but per unit it will remain same. For example, for example, for making 1 unit, you are incurring cost of $4. So it means for 2 units, the cost will be what? Cost will be $8. For 3 units, cost will be $12. For 4 units, cost will be $16. So as your level of activity is increasing, as your production is increasing, your cost is increasing, right? So such type of cost,
Yeah.
it is known as variable cost. Now this is the graph of total variable cost. While the level of activity is 1, the cost is 4. While the level of activity is 2, the cost is 8. While the level of activity is 3, the cost is 12, and so on. So it will be a straight upward line for total variable cost. Okay. And
Okay.
the variable cost per unit will be constant. It means that when you will calculate cost per unit, it will be same. Now, for example, let me calculate cost per unit here. Now, cost was 4 when units were 1. So cost per unit will be 4 divided by 1, 4. Cost was 8 when units were 2. So cost per unit will be 8 divided by 2, 4. Cost was 12 when units were 3. So 12 divided by 3, again cost per unit will be 4. Cost was 16 when the units were 4. So cost divided by unit will be again 4. So variable cost per unit is remaining same. It's same. It is not changing. So variable cost possesses two characteristics. Number one, in total it will increase, but per unit it will remain same. Okay. Now the variable cost per unit graph is this. It is a straight line graph. The reason is simple, because regardless of level of activity, the variable cost per unit will remain the same. Okay.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
graphs, you need to have an idea about the graphs, because examiner can test you by giving these graphs, and can ask you what behavior is the cost showing. Okay. So remember,
Yeah.
if if in a question you need to identify whether the cost is variable or not, you need to see two things. Number one, the total cost will increase with level of activity, but the cost per unit it will remain the same. So if a cost possesses these two characteristics, you will say that this cost is variable cost. Example of variable cost, all the direct cost, they are example of variable cost, like raw materials and labor. If your production is increasing, you need more raw materials, so you need to purchase more raw materials, cost will increase. Similarly, if your production is increasing, you need more labor hours, so you need to pay labor more, so the labor cost will also increase. So direct cost, they are example of variable cost. Okay.
Okay.
Now second
Yeah.
cost by behavior is fixed cost. Okay. What is fixed cost? A fixed cost is a cost which is incurred for an accounting period and which with certain activity level remains a constant. Such cost which remains constant within a certain level of activity, such cost is known as fixed cost. Okay. For example, a very simple example is the rent. Okay. Now, for example, rent of your building is, for example, $1,000. rent of a factory is $1,000. Okay. Now, regardless of your production, whether you produce 0 units, whether you produce 50 units, you need to pay off this rent. So this rent will be fixed cost. It does not depend upon level of activity. It will be fixed. Whether you produce 1 units in a factory, whether you produce 5 units, or whether you produce no units in a factory, you still need to pay that rent. So that rent will be your
Yeah.
fixed cost. Now here is a graph of total fixed cost. Now look, there is a cost and level of activity is zero. Still there is a cost. So it is indicating that while level of activity is zero and still there is a cost. So this cost is what? This cost is a fixed cost. Okay.
Okay.
Now fixed cost per unit declines. The fixed cost per unit graph is like this, the downwards curved shape graph. Okay. Now, for example, if your rent is 1000 and you are making 100 units, so your cost per unit will be, your cost is 1000 and units is 100, so cost per unit will be 10. Similarly, if you are preparing 200 units, if you are producing 200 units, so your cost per unit will be 1000 is your cost and your units is 200, so 5. So in this way your cost per unit is what? It's declining. Okay. And the decline is shown by this
Yeah.
downward curved shape graph. So this is the graph of fixed cost per unit and this is the graph of fixed cost total in total. So total fixed cost graph
Okay.
and variable cost per unit graph is same. Okay.
Okay.
Example of fixed cost is rent, insurance. Insurance cost is also fixed. Okay. You had
Okay.
studied the depreciation in F3 financial accounting. The depreciation is also fixed cost. Okay. And the business rates in
The
UK,
expense.
yes, it's an indirect expense and it's a fixed cost. And business rates in the UK, they are also fixed costs. Okay.
Okay.
So fixed cost clear.
Yeah, clear. Also, can I get the written notes after the class?
Well, you can screenshot the slides because I do not have notes in PDF form. When the class will be finished, I will move from the start. Then you can screenshot the slides one by one. And plus, for
Oh,
F2, for F2 you need to read the book. So because book is important for F2. So
okay.
I will share you the screenshots. Don't worry about them. But book reading is compulsory for F2 exam. You need to read the book.
Okay.
Okay.
Because while you're explaining, I could easily understand from the notes, written notes.
Okay. Also, I am recording the lecture, so I will share you the recording also, so they will help you also. Don't worry about it.
Okay, inshallah.
Okay.
Okay.
Now let's move on to the third cost. So by behavior, third cost is stepped fixed cost. We talked about fixed cost. Now we are talking about step fixed cost. Now what is step fixed cost? This is a type of fixed cost that is only fixed within certain level of activity. Once the upper limit of an activity level is reached, then a new higher level of fixed cost becomes relevant. Now, what is step fixed cost? Step fixed cost means that the cost is fixed, but up to a certain range. Up to a certain range, it's fixed. But whenever that range is breached, the cost will be there will be a step up in the cost. Such cost is known as step fixed cost. Okay. Now let me
Okay.
explain it to you with an example. Now there's an example given, warehousing cost. Now for example, you have a warehouse and you are paying rent of warehouse $1,000 and capacity of warehouse is to store, for example, 100 units. Okay.
Okay.
So when I will be plotting this in the graph, now this is level of activity. So up to 100 units, if your units are up to 100, you don't need to have an additional space. So your rent cost will be 1000. Okay. Now
Okay.
what if you got a order from customer, a huge order from customer, and you need to store the units, so you need an additional space, right? Because you need to store more units, so you need to have an additional space where you can store them. Okay, so you have to hire an additional space, you have to purchase an additional space, you have to rent out an additional space. Now for example, the rent of additional space is also $1000, and the capacity of that space is also 100 units. Now, if your level of activity, if your units are up to 100 units, you don't need to worry about any additional space. You know, you have a warehouse that can store up to 100 units. You just need to pay 1000 rent. That's it. Okay. But but
Okay.
when your capacity will exceed these 100 units, when your capacity will exceed these your 100 units, you need to hire an additional space, you need to rent out an additional space. So when you will rent out an additional space, you have to incur a cost. So there will be what, there will be step up in your cost, there will be step up in your cost. Your cost was 1000, but when you will hire additional space, it will increase by 1000, and now it will be what, it will be 2000.
2000.
And your capacity up to 200 units. So now up to next 100 units, it will again remain what, fixed. So up to next
Yeah.
100 units, it will be fixed. Similarly, when you will exceed the capacity of 200 units, you need to hire an additional space. So again, there will be a step up in the cost. Okay. So in this
Okay.
way, you understand the step fixed cost concept. Step fixed cost is a cost that remains fixed up to a certain range, and when that range is exceed, there will be a step up in cost. So such a cost is known as step fixed cost. Clear?
Okay. Yeah,
Now,
clear.
one more thing, one more example of step fixed cost is salaries. Salaries. When I talk about salary, so a salary is a fixed cost, okay? A salary of a one person, it will be a fixed cost. But when I will talk about salaries, it will be more than one salary. So then it will become step fixed cost. For example, let me give you another example. That if in the question he asked you about, tell me what is the supervisor's salary? Is it fixed cost or step fixed cost? Now, salary of one supervisor, it will be a fixed cost. For example, you have a supervisor, and supervisor can supervise up to 20 employees. Now the level of activity is employees. Okay. Now,
Okay.
one supervisor can manage 20 employees, and you are paying supervisor the salary of $500. So when your employees are up to 20, you just need to pay supervisor what? $500. That's it. It will be a fixed cost. But when, for example, company needs to hire more individuals, company needs to hire more employees. So when these employees will increase and they will go above 20, so you need to hire one more supervisor, and you will pay him more salary. So salary of one was 500, so salary of two will be 1000. Okay. And
Okay.
he can again supervise up to next 20 employees. So again, the cost was fixed up to 20, but when the employees increased above 20, you have to hire an additional supervisor. So there will be step up in cost, and again that cost will become fixed, and in this way it will continue on. Okay.
Okay.
So supervisor salaries is also a type of step fixed cost. One salary is a fixed cost, a salary, single salary, it is a fixed cost. But when it becomes salaries, then it will be a stepped cost, step fixed cost. Clear?
Okay.
Clear?
Yeah, clear.
Now the last cost by behavior, it is semi-variable cost. Okay, semi-variable cost, by word you can identify that this cost is, few portion of the cost is variable, and the rest portion of the cost will be what? It will be a fixed cost.
Yes.
So a cost that have fixed and variable elements both included in it will be known as semi-variable cost. Okay. Example,
Okay.
common example of semi-variable cost are your bills, okay, your utility bills. Okay. For example, electricity bill, telephone bills, internet bills. Now in the bills, there is two things. Number one, it will be a fixed line rental. Okay, fixed line rental. And second thing is consumption based bill. How many units you are consuming? For example, you get an electricity bill which has a fixed line rental of rupees 400. For example, in Pakistan, it's 400 rupees. That this line
Okay.
rental you have to pay it, regardless of whether you have used the electricity or not. Okay, this thing you need to
Okay.
pay. So this is known as fixed line rental. And the above cost that you need to pay, it depends upon the consumption. That how many electricity units, or if it is telephone bill, how many calls have you made. Okay, so
Okay.
this comprises of two costs, fixed cost plus variable cost both. So this
Yeah.
such a cost is known as semi-variable cost. Now you can see in the total cost graph that the level of
It's
activity is zero, but still there is a cost. So this cost
yeah.
is representing the fixed line rental, okay, that I told you 400 rupees, for example.
Okay.
And the above is a variable one. So the above variable one, it is representing the consumption of units. Okay, that how much
Okay.
are you consuming. If it is electricity bill, how many units of electricity are you consuming. If it is a telephone bills, how many number of calls you are making. Okay, so
Okay.
such a cost is known as semi variable cost. And this is how the total semi variable cost graphs looks like. Okay,
Okay.
the cost semi-variable cost per unit graphs looks like this. The curved downward slope, the curved downward shape, it is representing the fixed cost per unit element. Okay, the fixed cost per unit element. And the straight dotted line, it's representing the variable cost per unit element. When we studied fixed cost and variable cost, we talked about it. Look, variable cost per unit is constant, right? It's the straight line. And fixed cost per unit is downward curved shape, right? So in semi-variable cost, because it is the combination of both fixed and variable, so this downward curved shape is representing the fixed cost per unit element, and the straight line, dotted straight line, is representing the variable cost per unit element. So this is your semi-variable cost. Clear?
Okay.